Peter Antes was born in 1942 in Mannheim, Germany. As a university student in Freiburg and in Paris, he studied Catholic theology and the science of religions. His habilitation was in the history of religions and in comparative religions. He accepted a position as a professor of religion at the University of Hanover in 1973, where he completed this article 29 years later in 2002. He also spent time as an invited professor at universities in Geneva and Tokyo and at the Gregoriana in Rome. He retired and became professor emeritus at Hanover in 2011. This article draws on his wide experience with the comparative study of religion in different cultures to help us address the question of why there are different religions in the world by looking at how people interpret their personal religious experiences. When sociologists set out to study the phenomenon of organized religion, we probably are no different from anybody else in asking, first of all, what exactly we mean by religion. Look in almost any introductory sociology textbook, and you find a set of chapters, usually called the institutional chapters, because they survey major institutions, including the family, the economy, the political system, and of most interest to us now, religion. These basic institutions get their own chapters because we often think of them as standard features of every society. In some social settings, they may be braided together so tightly that you can't talk about one without talking about them all, or in larger, more complex social systems, each institution can get sorted into its own social space, so that when you're at home, you're not at work, or when you're at work, you're not in church, and so on. But what sets the institution of religion apart from the others to justify giving it a separate chapter or a separate course? The standard answer to this question is that religion deals with an aspect of life that none of the others do. The question of what some sociologists have called the ultimate ends of action. Thou shalt not kill. Why not? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Why not? Religion tells us why not, what is right, what is wrong, and why they are right or wrong. As we will develop in more detail later, religion puts us in direct contact with what we will call the sacred, a realm from which we can find out not only what is in the world around us, but the way things should be. Religion provides meaning in life. Theologians and others concerned about such issues have developed a whole range of explanations of just how we manage to make this contact with the realm of the sacred. And it is worth reviewing these ideas before diving into Antes' article on religious experience. If you ask believers in many of the world's great religions how they know about God, about good versus evil and such things, the most common answer will be that at some time and place, God has actually communicated these ideas to us by direct contact. Allah inspired Muhammad to write down these things in the Quran. Yahweh spoke directly to Old Testament prophets and divinely inspired the writers of books of the New Testament. An angel appeared to Joseph Smith and told him where to dig up the golden tablets on which he would find the Book of Mormon. God told Joan of Arc to rally the French and resist the English invaders. This kind of divine revelation furnishes the least ambiguous kind of contact with the sacred. The rules of good and evil may even be carved in stone for all to see. The passage of centuries may still bring up some problems and ambiguities, even with such revelations, of course. For example, there's no mention of buttons anywhere in the Bible. So one group of Amish Christians have only hooks and eyes on their clothes and will not use buttons. But divine revelation at least gets some basic ground rules established for a society. If you have not enjoyed the privilege of experiencing divine revelation, and if you're not too sure that other people have gotten the details of such experiences quite right, you still have another option for finding points of contact with the sacred. This version of explanation relies on what theologians call the natural knowledge of God. Before the philosophers split off from the theologians and embarked on their quest to find the meaning of life using only logic and reason itself, They all shared a general consensus that the existence of an orderly universe actually proved the existence of God's divine power, because without such divine ordering, everything would be chaos. This natural knowledge of God explanation is still extremely popular with people who find God's handiwork in everything, from the force of gravity to natural logarithms or the cycle of the seasons. When confronted with the crazy, fundamentally unpredictable implications of Niels Bohr's quantum physics, Albert Einstein explained his discomfort with the quantum theory by insisting that God does not play dice with the universe. By this he meant that we need accept as basic article of faith that the world is a predictable place. But theologians have not stopped with just divine revelation and natural knowledge as sources of our contact with the sacred. Even when the predictability of the natural order breaks down in spectacular ways, cultures all around the world have translated all kinds of natural disasters and strange events into religious signals. When Mauna Loa in Hawaii began to shake the islands and pour out streams of lava, the islanders knew that Pele, the fire goddess, was unhappy, and they looked around trying to identify what they were doing that might be upsetting her. When the bubonic plague ravaged Europe over and over again, not only common people, but the Pope himself on his throne in Rome often concluded that they were being punished for the sinful age in which they lived. And the supernatural origins of natural disturbances do not have to be massive like a volcano or a tsunami. If the yams in your garden mysteriously wither and rot in the ground, your nasty neighbor may have used magic to ruin them. You might keep a talisman hanging by your door to ward off the evil eye of strangers. The common denominator for these diverse explanations is that the world around us that seems so commonplace and predictable is also filled with intangible meanings and powers that can bring us joy and destruction. This intangible realm of the sacred, with all of its power and potential power, of course fascinates us irresistibly. We look for it in every rock and tree in animistic beliefs that find it everywhere. We explain tornadoes and lottery jackpots and birth and death as miracles with sacred causes. All of these explanations actually are irrelevant for our purpose of developing a sociological perspective on religion. All of these different ingenious ideas of divine revelation, natural knowledge of God, and animistic explanations of everyday events are all about interpreting and understanding personal religious experiences. They attempt to explain those intimately private, personal flashes of individual sensations, a wave of indescribable comfort and joy in the midst of a prayer or a hymn, or an equally indescribable wave of terror and despair in the face of death or other misfortune. All such personal religious experiences ultimately are unique, private, and completely impossible to communicate to any other person in truly meaningful terms, so we can hardly make a scientific study of them. Equally importantly, these personal religious experiences do not by themselves make a religion. They may be the raw materials out of which people construct a religion, but in themselves they do not provide blueprints for such society-wide constructions. So keep in mind as you think about N.T.'s article that he is looking at such personal religious experiences. What he finds out about them gives us a valuable hint about that construction process, about how we can shift from a preoccupation with personal religious experiences to the question of religion as an institutionalized dimension of society. Many of the most important scholars in the social sciences have tackled the question of why virtually every human society seems to have developed organized religion as one of the fundamental social institutions. They assume that personal religious experiences happen, but they want to figure out why a whole society would organize and build up such experiences into a particular institutional form as an organized religion. The common denominator for these scholars is that they look for a connection between the religion and its doctrines on one hand, and the everyday connections or relationships between people in a society on the other. The starting assumption for such explorations holds that all organized social behavior accomplishes some kind of goal or purpose. So what, they ask, is the purpose accomplished by a religion? Attempts to answer this question can go in quite different directions. For example, the psychology of religion poses the question strictly with reference to the individuals who report personal religious experiences. Psychologists like Sigmund Freud often assumed that any individual making such reports were fooling themselves, whether such people lived in Hawaii long ago and believed that a fire god caused volcanoes to erupt, or lived in contemporary European societies and believed that the bubonic plague was a punishment from God or that witches had to be discovered and punished. For Freud, even great world religions like Christianity or Islam were illusions. He once wrote that, quote, "Religion is an illusion and derives its great strength from the fact that it falls in with our instinctual desires," unquote. People feel a need for security and forgiveness, so they invent God to provide these gifts. This makes religious beliefs an answer to the personal problems of an individual. Once again, Freud's perspective seeks to explain personal religious experiences. The German sociologist Georg Simmel followed a similar line of reasoning, but from a different perspective. Many religions demand that believers must accept their doctrines as an act of faith, not asking for evidence or proof. Where, Simmel asks, do we get this idea of faith itself? Why should we believe things without any direct experience or evidence that they're true? Simmel's answer was that the abstract idea of religious faith mirrors our social experiences of human interaction. We find out that other people will take our word for something that we tell them, or for something that we promise to do, and we may also learn to trust others ourselves in the same way. While this kind of trust is based on experience, we translate that basic feeling into an abstraction and apply it to our religious beliefs. While this view again sees religious belief originating in everyday human life, this time it is not coming from some kind of internal developmental process within individuals. It originates in social interactions between people rather than welling up from someplace inside each one of them. A third version of explanation for personal religious beliefs and experiences appears in the writings of Karl Marx. He also thought that religious ideas originate in social interactions between people, but for him these interactions took a very specific form. Marx saw the world as a zero-sum conflict between different classes of people, the owners of property and the workers who owned nothing and so had to sell their labor to the owners for whatever the owners would pay them. He described virtually all social institutions, including a society's legal system, its economic organization, its political system, and also organized religion, as tools that were controlled and manipulated by the owners of property in order to distract and mislead the great mass of the population so that they would accept the power of the owner class and continue to work for them rather than rising up and destroying them. He referred to religion as the opiate of the masses in an age when countries like England, Germany, or Japan were literally selling opium in vast amounts to the population of China in order to control and exploit them. The crisis of opioid drug abuse in the United States in the early 21st century is often viewed in the same way, as a way of escape offered by powerful pharmaceutical corporations to the people most affected by the growing inequality in American life. In all of these explanations, from Freud's dismissal of personal religious beliefs as an infantile psychological illusion, to Marx's dismissal of organized religious institutions as tools for the rich to control the poor, we always seem to find religion being described as somehow fake, misguided, stupid, or even harmful. For Freud, religion was an illusion, but the developmental process of the human mind was real. For Marx, religion also was an illusion, but the material conflict between classes of people was real. However, there's another famous dead sociologist who had yet another perspective on religion and society, and he probably has had a bigger impact on how we think about religion in the discipline of sociology than any of the others. His name was Emil Durkheim. He was born in France in 1858 and died in 1917, a year before the end of the First World War. He lived for only 59 years, dying at the same age as my own father half a century later. Because he lived so early in the 20th century, like all of his colleagues in that age, Durkheim learned a now extinct version of psychological theory called associationism that hardly anybody remembers or knows much about today. Unlike contemporary biology and behaviorist psychology rooted firmly in the physical world of atoms, molecules, chemicals, and cells, associationism viewed reality as dualistic. There was one universe of physical reality encompassing all of space and time and everything in it, but there was also a second parallel universe of mental reality completely distinct from the physical universe. Just as the physical universe had elementary particles like atoms, or later protons and electrons, or later still quarks of many colors and flavors, the mental universe had elementary particles called ideas, governed by its own separate mental laws. For example, physical particles with like charges, such as negatively charged electrons, repelled each other. But mental particles with like charges, such as two positive ideas, attracted each other instead. Like ideas, therefore, would group together to make more complex systems of beliefs. If, however, some very different foreign idea intruded into a mind with a nice assembled group of like ideas, it would disrupt the stability of that mind and cause mental stress and disturbance. In fact, wherever a human being existed, the physical universe and the mental universe, otherwise completely separate and distinct, somehow became connected to one another through these creatures with both a body and a mind. This meant that disturbances from the mental universe, caused by unlike ideas interfering with each other, could ripple across the connection that existed within human beings and cause actual physical consequences, psychosomatic illnesses of the body caused by problems in the mental universe. Somatopsychic problems could also occur. People who lost an arm or leg in the physical universe could continue to feel the phantom limb because the memory of the body as a whole was still there in the mental universe. Durkheim even developed a famous extension of this associationist perspective, suggesting that in the mental universe, these ideas of whole groups of people could join together to form an even larger coherent system of beliefs, what he called a collective conscience or consciousness. This notion of a collective conscience forms the heart of Durkheim's view of the world. For example, he suggested in his book, Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, that even small primitive social groups always develop symbolic representations of their collective group existence in the form of a totem, a concrete expression of their common bond, such as a bird or an animal or a plant or some feature of the landscape or the sky. This symbol is a translation of their unity in the mental universe, of a shared collective consciousness, into an identified feature of the physical universe. Once we understand this dualistic associationist view of the world held by Durkheim and so many of his contemporaries through the first third of the 20th century, we gain a much clearer view of how Durkheim thought about religion. On one hand, Durkheim observed more than once that the essence of religion is not about individuals at all. Religion, he said, is a social phenomenon. The physical reality of a religion is to be found in the interactions of people, organized into accepted rituals of behavior and belief. Already in his first published book, The Division of Labor in Society, Durkheim echoed people like Simmel in saying that religious beliefs reflect social organization. But he was not optimistic about this connection and saw the threat coming from that increasing scale and complexity of life reflected in the book's title, The Division of Labor in Society. Quote, "There is a decreasing number of collective beliefs and sentiments which are both collective enough and strong enough to take on a religious character. As all other beliefs take on a character less and less religious, the individual becomes the object of a sort of religion. It is still from society that it takes all its force, but it is not to society that it attaches us, it is to ourselves." Unquote. So for Durkheim, while the physical universe of interactions between people shapes and influences religion, religious ideas or their absence can also affect social organization. Society, Durkheim said, is ultimately a religious phenomenon. Without the religious symbolism expressing the mental reality of the collective conscience, our material social connections also can become problematic. Since the mental and physical universes exist side by side, connected only through the mind-body links of human beings, we can never assign either one of them as a cause and the other one as an effect. They are both real for the associationist, and each interact with the other. With some background sketched in for how sociologists connect religions to the social contexts in which they exist, we can turn to Anti's short discussion of how people interpret their personal religious experiences. He explicitly ties such interpretation to those social contexts. After studying a wide range of different first-person attempts to describe personal religious experiences, Antis explains that virtually all such accounts start with some kind of exceptional sensations, very different from the sights and sounds of everyday life. Given the dominant role of vision among the human senses, it does not surprise him to find many accounts of people seeing a bright light. Near-death experiences, for example, often begin with a person seeing a brilliant, almost blinding light to which they seem irresistibly drawn. In the Bible, Saul, on the road to Damascus, saw a blinding light that made him fall to the ground. God came to Moses in the light of a burning bush, which was not consumed by the fire. But in all these examples, light only opens the door, so to speak, to the specifics of the religious experience. The really interesting thing for Antis is that many people report that they see and hear and sometimes even touch more specific manifestations during these personal experiences. And most interesting to him of all, virtually everyone who sees visions and hears voices, like Joan of Arc some centuries ago, can identify who it is that appears in such a vision. Antis argues that this illustrates a general principle in cognitive research about how people put identifying labels on their feelings. The principle does not apply only to religious visions. Imagine that you step out a shop door onto the sidewalk, and there in front of you suddenly you see your one true love. Your eyes meet. You both smile radiant smiles. Describe your physical sensations. Dilation of your pupils, flaring of nostrils, dryness in your mouth, faster breathing, a tightening sensation in the pit of your stomach, perhaps perspiration on your palms. How do you interpret these sensations? Why, it must be love. But now imagine yourself on a precarious swinging rope bridge, hundreds of feet above a canyon, filled with jagged rocks and a raging river below. Before you, wild-eyed tribesmen with spears glare at you from the end of the bridge. Behind you, other tribesmen are shouting and waving furiously at you. Describe your physical sensations? Amazingly, you could well come up with exactly the same list as from the sidewalk earlier. How do you interpret the same sensations this time? Why, it must be terror. Finally, remember when you were 8 years old, lying on the playground, your fist clenched, glaring up at the classmate who's just knocked you down and who you are now determined to attack with all your fury? Describe your physical sensations? Well, what do you know? It's the same list as the other 2 times. But this time you decide that these sensations indicate rage. In other words, we always interpret all of our material, physical sensations within a social context that gives them some kind of specific meaning. Antis just extends this general principle to personal religious experience. Whatever sensations we feel when we have a personal religious experience, we connect them to our cultural context and interpret them in that context. This is why, Antis explains, when people in Italy or Spain have personal religious visions, they see people like the Virgin Mary, or perhaps one or more of the saints, or angels, or other familiar Christian characters. They don't see Pele, the Hawaiian fire goddess. They don't see a feathered Aztec serpent. Similarly, when people in India have personal religious visions, they see Lord Krishna, or Kali the Destroyer, or Durga, or other characters from the Hindu pantheon. They don't see Moses or the Virgin Mary, except perhaps if they're Catholics in India, or Thor with his hammer, or the Navajo coyote trickster god. We inevitably must interpret any transcendent religious experience in terms of the familiar context of the material culture in which we live, because we have no alternative frame of reference.
A more general way to refocus this result from Anti's article is to rephrase the question we asked at first: what purpose does a religion serve? Instead, let us ask a quite different question. Why are there different religions? We certainly can't have an answer to that question rooted in any kind of universal human nature. Freud's ideas of a fundamental developmental process taking place in all human beings might explain the need for religious beliefs, but it offers no explanation for why different groups of people in different times and places come up with so many different versions of organized religion. You can't explain a variable with a constant. We must turn to the context of the society within which each religion is developed and sustained. Since they're all different, the religions also are all different. Another way to think about this could start with the image of the neural network that links together the nerve cells within your own brain. The intricate pattern of contacts that are formed, strengthened, or changed by the interactions between ourselves as organisms and the world around us. In this analogy, we might think of the personal religious experiences of individual people as the electric impulses that are triggered in one cell or another of the brain. We may not always know what causes a particular impulse or a particular religious experience. But in a sense, this doesn't really matter, because what we are interested in for developing a sociology of religion as an institutionalized part of a society is the pattern of connections, of what we might call social synapses, between the people who make up the society in question. If the personal religious experience is the electric spark of thought, then the organized religion is the neural network of the brain as a whole. It is this network that determines what happens to the spark of a particular impulse. An institutionalized religion in its social context determines what happens to a personal religious experience and how we decide to interpret it.